So, apologies for getting started late here in true conference fashion. Session number one. This isn't even session number one, but we're late anyway. So, no excuses. Okay. This is a session that is focused on importing and exporting data from acquisitions. And I think a little preface would be we're going to look at existing functionality first. We want to do a bit of an overview of what's available for orders, for invoices, and we'll look at some specific features, and then we'll talk more broadly about general workflows. I think that's a fair way to summarize it. And we wanted to save some time at the end for some discussion. So depending on how time works out here, we might have some opportunity to have a bit of a brainstorming exercise. We've got a number of folks that are online and a number of folks in the room. So I don't know how well this is all going to work out, but I hope everyone can hear and see, and that sounds like what you came here for. And with that,
why don't you remind us we're getting the chat.
Oh, we're seeing everything. Right. So that's the screen. Okay. So I have to use this for the slides. Yeah. Okay. So this is essentially what we're going to look at first is orders. And we want to mention the different ways that you're able to import or export orders. So this is the broad overview portion. And on the slide here, you can see it's worded sort of in workflow format that you may start on the vendor site, or you may, you may be wanting to have a file that you're trying to load into FOLIO, or files in FOLIO you're trying to export out of FOLIO. So the first way to quote unquote import order information into FOLIO is via the APIs. And this is an example of Gobi, the Gobi integration, because this was essentially the first system that we integrated in this way. It's currently the only third-party system that we know of that's using this API to create orders in FOLIO. So what you're seeing, the little GIF here that might be a little tricky to follow, but quicker than logging in and doing it all myself, is a user starting in the Gobi system, which is what just happened there, and actually selecting, finding something that they want to order, adding that to a cart, clicking order, and it's being sent via API into FOLIO. So Gobi is sending XML data to FOLIO, authenticated using an API key, and using the Edge Orders module to route that information to an internal module called mod Gobi. And currently the only internal module is mod Gobi, but Edge Orders was built to accept information and route it to modules internally. The idea here being, it's not built specifically for Gobi. The module inside is built specifically for Gobi. But this method of integration was designed to accommodate multiple third parties.
And there's no restrictions on that? We've had inquiries from some of the other vendors, but nobody has taken the initiative yet to try to connect.
Not that we're aware of. Yeah, go ahead. So the specifics, the part that's specific to Gobi is mod Gobi, which is a module inside of FOLIO. So you could think of it as Edge Orders is the routing module. So you can send your stuff there and tell Edge Orders where you'd like that data sent inside of FOLIO. Mod Gobi is the place where Gobi sends its XML, and mod Gobi does mapping. It basically takes the data that's come in and it constructs it in such a way that mod orders will understand what it's asking for.
and data.
There's two
Edge orders
options.
is the router.
Yeah.
The parser part.
Sorry. So the question was, quick
If
summarize.
you want to integrate with another vendor, would they need to do, what would they need to do basically?
Yeah. Can you reuse ModGobi? So the answer is really two options. You can use ModGobi if you want, because you can route multiple things to ModGobi. But if you're going to do that, the XML file that's coming in has to look like what Gobi produces, because that's what it's expecting. The other option would be to duplicate ModGobi and make some changes to it and use a similar version of that XML file. The third option would be to just create a totally different mod XYZ and use edge orders to route the info there. Yeah. And that actually,
oh, yeah, that's me. Okay. And you're logged on to BugFest, or are you?
yes.
Okay. So another way of being able to create orders in FOLIO, hi Scott, is as of last release, to use MARC files to bring in order data and use that to create orders in FOLIO. And you may be creating orders that represent titles that you've already ordered in the vendor system. So you're basically just making a copy of that in FOLIO. Or some libraries choose to take selected titles out of the system, bring those into FOLIO as pending orders, and then decide when and if they're going to place orders for those things. And then at that point, they will open them. The thing with pending orders or with selected materials on vendor sites is that if you do that workflow, the vendor doesn't have the order until you send it back to them, which is where the part of being able to send those orders out of FOLIO is important. And so Dennis is going to talk about that in a minute. In my experience, libraries will do that workflow when they are gathering selections, and then they want to release those selections as orders when they have money, or if they have leftover money toward the end of the year, and these are maybe tier 2 or tier 3 orders, and they're going to release as much as they have money left. So with data import, when you are creating an order via data import, there is a new field mapping profile that you use to create those orders. And hopefully we're going to be able to get into BugFest. Yes. So I'm in Orchid BugFest, and I created this profile last night, so I didn't have to stand here and try to create it in front of you. And I also want to show you, I need your email. And I need the, okay, where's the ones I just sent you? Thank you. Okay.
So,
oh, do you have MARC Edit on your machine? I bet you don't.
I do not.
Okay. All right. I'm not going to be able to show you them very well because Dennis doesn't have MARC Edit, but we'll take a look at one in FOLIO. But basically, you work out with your vendor that you're placing the orders or making selections, the fields of data that you are going to need to create the order in FOLIO. And you may be mapping that data into MARC fields. Price is a good example where it's going to change for every item. Quantity may or may not change. But then there's things that you may not need to map into the record that you may be able to default into your profile. And so things like location, if you're loading ebooks, you may only have one location, so you may not need to map that. When you create a profile for creating orders, if you're going to also create inventory based on those incoming MARC records, you need to create the orders first and then create as much inventory as you intend to, starting with instances, then holdings, then items. And so the profile that we've got here in Bugfest is creating the orders first, then creating the instances, then creating holdings, and creating items. And in these cases, these are kind of preliminary holdings and items, especially because you won't have those finalized until if it's print, you get the books and you assign call numbers and you assign barcodes. If it's until you get the URL that's going to give you access to it. But the main thing I wanted to show you here is the profile for creating orders. And I'm going to take you into the, we're going to go to the field mapping profile. And I'm going to edit it so that we can take a look at the details. So with purchase order status, you can set the purchase orders to be either pending, so they're pre-orders, or open. You can only set them to open if you have permission to open purchase orders. And if approval is required before you can open orders, you have to have permission. Whoever's doing the importing has to have permission to approve orders. Most libraries don't have that approval step, but it's something to keep in mind. In Bugfest, the purchase order line limit setting that we have is 3. So the maximum purchase order lines that I want on a purchase order is 3. You can override that in your field mapping profile here to be something other than that. I don't want to change it, but it's in the way. And so here I'm saying I just want to have 1 purchase order line on each purchase order. I don't want to have 3 on each. If I wanted to assign a prefix or a suffix to the purchase order number that's going to be assigned, I could pick that prefix or suffix. And then super important is the organization lookup. So who is the vendor that I am trying to place this order with? Order type always defaults to 1 time. The number of ongoing orders that a library has is typically way less than your one-time orders. And this is not usually a workflow that you have with your ongoing orders. I didn't assign acquisitions units, but again, just like with approving, if you are importing and assigning to a particular acquisitions unit, you need to be a part of that acquisitions unit, or else it's not going to allow you to create the order. And that has definitely tripped up some libraries. Bill to, ship to, you may or may not fill in. And particularly if this represents something that you've already ordered, chances are the vendor already knows where they need to bill it and ship it. The title details and the bibliographic details are something that you're going to need to map. Over in inventory, you don't really need to map them because we have a default map from the MARC Bib to the instance, but in the purchase order line, we don't. So I've got mapping for the 245A and B in the title field. And then down here in the publication and publisher fields, I'm covering my bases just in case there's still 260s floating around. So I'm saying get the pub date from 264 subfield C if you can, otherwise get it from 260 subfield C. And same thing with publisher and subfield B. Product ID, the most important one that you're going to typically run across is going to be the ISBN, possibly ISMN. And then down here is where you start to get into the details of the purchase order line. So your acquisitions method, typically you're going to default into the field mapping profile. You're not going to try to map it from the incoming MARC record. The order format, this was a group of ebook orders that I imported last night. Receipt status, because it's ebooks, I'm making this receipt not required. And not really worrying too much about cancellation info. And then Another very important field, when you place the order on the vendor site first, the vendor does not have the FOLIO purchase order line number because there is no FOLIO purchase order line number when you create the order on the vendor site. And so if you want to have something to be able to match an incoming invoice to, very important that you map a vendor reference number of some kind into the purchase order line. And so with Gobi, there is a Gobi order key, and it is in 982 subfield A of the file that I imported. And so I'm saying grab that number and assign reference type of vendor order reference number. These are ebooks, so there's no physical price or quantity physical. My currency is USD. My electronic price, I'm expecting to get from 960 subfield S. My quantity, I'm expecting to get from 960D. And if there is no quantity by chance, I don't want the order to fail. So I'm giving it a backstop that says, if there is no 960 subfield D, then assign a quantity of 1. If there's no quantity in your order, the order line can't be created. And I want to do everything I can to keep the order lines from failing. And then down toward the bottom, we have the fund information. I've got a fund coming from 960 subfield U. We're only going to use one fund to pay for this stuff, so I don't have to split my fund distributions. My location is the E online location coming from 960 subfield A. My quantity, I've done the same thing as the quantity up with the price. And there's no physical resource details because it's not a physical resource. And nothing really important as far as the e-resource details. Create inventory is not happening in this part of the profile because we're creating the inventory through the data import profile. And so in the create holdings, I've got mapping that says, grab the location from this particular field. In the create item, I have just some default information. And so very quickly, I just want to flip back over to data import. And I want to show you the imported file.
2 quick questions from the chat as you navigate.
Okay.
There. So someone wanted to confirm, or Molly wanted to confirm, here.
Is the gist of it is it possible to, if you have 30 MARC files, to create one order with 30 lines versus create 30 orders each with 1 line?
If you have 30 separate files, you need to smush them together into one file before you try to import them. If you have 30 separate files, it's going to create 30 separate orders. But that's where MARC Edit is your friend.
And then one more question, or maybe a comment, that with the ISBN, I tend to run into problems with the validation of the invoice number, not always used in the MARC record, or not always being in the MARC record.
The invoice number?
Invoice $Q.
Oh, the subfield Q,
ISBN,
the qualifier info, the subfield Q not being in there. Yeah, I think we need to look at that because I was running into that a little bit yesterday. So we'll write that one down and take a look at that one. Christy.
That like the U?
It's the fund code. Yep. So because Orchid Bugfest has quite the craziness with the funds and budgets and things, I ended up making up new funds and assigning new budgets, and it's just whatever your code is for the fund. So there were 17 records in the file that I imported, and it created the MARC bib in source record storage. It created the order first, and then it created the instance, the holdings, and the item. And if I go to this first one, hopefully you'll see the order. Come on. There we go. And so it took the title info from the 245 A and B, There were a whole bunch of ISBNs in this one, so it took all those ISBNs. We've got publication info and publisher, and it assigned a purchase order line number when it created the purchase order, but the vendor doesn't know this purchase order line number. So the very important thing for the vendor for invoicing purposes is the vendor reference number. So this mapped in from whatever 9XX field I told it to. We don't have any physical prices, but we have the electronic price and the quantity and an estimated price without any discount. And then in the fund, either in the MARC file or defaulted, I can't remember which I did, CE books is the code for the fund, which stands for current ebooks. And so as long as I have CE books in the MARC subfield or defaulted into my profile, if I'm going to always use that for my ebooks, either one should fill in the fund properly.
Molly got a follow-up question in chat. Do you need me to read it?
Yeah, she puts the job.
To clarify, if it's a single MARC file containing 30 records with a line limit of 1, would that create 30 separate POs, or would I need to split that MARC file into 30 separate files with 1 record each?
If it's a file of 30 records with a line limit of 1, you would get 30 purchase order lines. If you want all 30 of them to end up on 1 purchase order, then you need to set your line limit in your field mapping profile to something higher than 30. So approval plan shipments are one where libraries will sometimes set them larger. So if you wanted everything on 1, you might set your limit to 50 or 100. And then as long as you didn't hit 50 or you didn't hit 100, everything would go on 1 purchase order. All right, and then we've got a little bit of e-resource details down here. And you'll see that the title is a hot link, which tells me that there's an instance. So in this case, the instance is created from the incoming MARC record. So the instance is going to have more details on it than the order had, because the order only has, a handful of bibliographic fields on it. But we have the instance that was created here. I think the only thing I assigned in the instance was a not yet assigned status. We have a preliminary holdings that was created that just says it's an electronic holdings. And we have a preliminary item, which you may or may not actually create for your ebooks, that says it's on order and has no barcode. Yes.
Okay. And you set that line limit to an unlimited?
No.
Not have a limit?
No.
Have a limit.
Because what is our maximum? So 999, because we only have 3 places for the purchase order line field.
Okay.
And if you're ordering more than 999 in one day from one vendor, it's impressive. So, yeah, we have tested the line limit and the line limit override a lot, so we know that that works well. And so if you place your order on the vendor site and you loaded this as an approved open purchase order, you're done. You're just waiting for the material to come in or to get notified about the ebook and waiting for your invoice. If you selected this on the vendor website and you imported it to create a pending order, now you need to get that order back to the vendor. And this is where the work that Dennis and the Thunderjets did to make it so that we could export orders out of FOLIO. So I'm going to hand it back to Dennis.
Yeah. So the Edifact, so you are able to export order information in Edifact format as of, actually it was before Orchid, it was Nolana, sorry. And yeah, Nolana. So what you're seeing here, this export is built from organization. So it's each organization record can have integration details, which is what you just saw there. meaning that each organization record could have multiple exports associated with it if you wanted to do that. The exports are configured by account number. So an organization file in FOLIO that represents a vendor can have multiple accounts on it. You can then build integrations that say, if there's an order for this account number, export it in this way, or export it via Edifact to this FTP location. So you start by building these integrations on the organization record. And there's an accordion called integration details, which is where you can add multiple configurations. From that point, this is going to flip over to the export manager where you see the jobs that have run. So there's an organizations tab in the export manager at the moment that focuses on Edifact order export jobs at the moment. So the reason why it was created as a separate tab was that we needed to have more detailed filtering options to be able to find the export jobs that you're running and that you want to, investigate or rerun or whatever you may want to do with those. So in the export manager, there is that tab for organizations. And within that, you can explore all of the jobs that have run for all organizations. You can filter down to a specific organization, even filter down to a specific job that is being run for that organization. And these are things that are scheduled either daily or weekly or monthly. So the export runs at an interval. And the orders are picked up based on the account number and this little flag that is called automate, or that's labeled automate export. So in the orders UI, you will see a flag for automate export, and that is how the system knows that it needs to pick that up. There's some nuance there. In orders, you can sort of force an order record to be a manual order. There's a flag at the order level that says this is a manual order, so basically never export it. So you can make that choice when you're creating an order, or you can allow it to basically potentially be exported automatically, and based on whatever account number you assign to that order, if that account number is configured to be exported, it will do all that work sort of as you're filling out the order, as you're creating the order. There are a few other features that are built onto this more recently, and that is the ability to download or resend exported files. So when you end up in the logs in this area here, under that actions menu in the top right, you have the ability to download the EDI file that was exported based on that job, essentially from FOLIO, or you can resend it. So you can have that exact EDI file resent to the FTP location, or you can rerun the export, which would produce a new file with potentially different orders on it. That makes sense. So there's some nuance there. We also introduced the ability to re-export a specific order. So in the order actions menu, if an order has been exported, you have the ability to export it again, which ultimately triggers a new export. And it will include that file. So now we're going to talk a little bit about invoices, unless there are some questions first. Okay.
So I create an order. Get it. Yeah, I ordered something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So go to the export manager here. Easiest way to answer this question. What you need to do, so this is the tricky part. We had this problem where the modules need to be re-enabled for exports to actually happen. The only way to run force run an export is to actually load a job and rerun. So in the actions menu, you see this option. You do see it? Yeah. For rerun. So there has to be a job there currently for you to be able to rerun that specific set of details. So you're actually rerunning the job, not triggering it.
Yeah.
That's right. There's no way to, like, without a schedule, to say manually run this at the moment. Yeah, we're going to look a little bit at the functionality that's planned, but that's not specifically on the list. I think it's just a story that we have, not a feature. But yeah.
Yeah,
excellent point.
Schedulers all over the place in Folio that we don't have quite that.
So we'll go back to invoices quickly. And I think probably most everyone knows that you have the ability, well, I hope you do at this point, to manually create invoices in Folio. So you can go to the invoice application, click create new, you create an invoice, and those invoices that you create, the structure is similar to purchase order in Folio. There's an invoice and invoice lines that represent things that you are paying for. And we're not going to talk about creating invoices necessarily, just methods of creating invoices. So one of the other ways to create an invoice that was introduced recently is the ability to take an order record and say, I want to generate an invoice for this order record. So it could be a single or a multi-line purchase order. But when you're in the orders application, you have an option for new invoice under the actions menu. And that will bring up the create invoice screen, but it will be pre-filled with details like organization and other things that we pull from the order record. So you have much less to do there. And then when you save the actual invoice header, if there's only one purchase order line, it will automatically create and add that purchase order line as an invoice line. If there are multiples, it'll actually ask you if you need to reorganize them so that you can have them in the specific order, specific sequence that they would appear on the actual PDF invoice. Which brings us to maybe slightly more interesting methods of creating.
Okay, I'm not going to go through the excruciating details of the job profile and the field mappings for Edifact. People are typically not as familiar with Edifact as they are with MARC. So we've tried to give you more guidance. We've set up some default profiles based on the 10 or 12 vendors that we heard from libraries as being their most important vendors. And then once you adopt one of those, you can duplicate it, and then you can change it or adapt it to have the details that you need it to have. And so in this one, I have set it up as a Gobi monographic invoice. I'm not going to go through all the details, but what I will tell you is that these are not as clear-cut mappings as the MARC mappings. So you are definitely advised to follow what you see in the default profiles or what we have on the wiki as examples. And if you ever run into something where there's not an example and you need it, then let us know and we'll try to add one. Same thing with acquisitions units. If you're assigning an acquisitions unit, you need to be part of that acquisitions unit if you're going to use this to create an invoice. Same thing with batch group. Or no, batch group doesn't apply to people. The most important thing in here is, where am I getting the info that's going to match to the purchase order line? And I may be getting it from, I may be trying to match to the purchase order line number, or if it's in a situation like the order that we looked at a couple minutes ago, there is no purchase order line number that the vendor knows about. And so I need to match to the vendor reference number. So in the file that I imported, there was no purchase order line number, but there were vendor reference line numbers for everything. And so it's going to try purchase order line first. If it doesn't find one, it's going to then try a vendor reference number. And then typically If you've got your fund in the purchase order line, you don't need to worry about the fund here. Otherwise, you may be defaulting a fund. You can read the fund from the incoming Edifact order. I think a few libraries do that. So you have some options there. And I want to keep us moving because I know we're running short a little bit. So I want to show you this invoice. We brought in a 7-line invoice. And the thing that I can tell by looking at this, so the invoice number is 726177. I can tell that 6 of the lines match to purchase order lines. The 7th line didn't match. It's all caps. So it used the default information from the incoming invoice line instead of the info from the purchase order line to fill in the title. And so when I go to look at this invoice and look at the invoice lines, whoops. All right, what did it do to me? I can't get to your back.
Yeah.
Okay, there it is. All right, I'm just gonna go to invoices if I can find invoices. And it was 726177, I think. Nope, I can't count apparently. I hate this bar. Okay, losing share. And let me go back one more time. What was my number? All right, fine, I'll go back to data import. All right. Sorry, I should have practiced more. That is the number, 726177. Oh, invoices. All right. Better not fail me.
Let me just reset.
I wonder if somebody deleted it. Okay. I think somebody deleted my invoice. No, this is Orchid Bug Fest. All right, so the joy of live demos. So let me go back to data import. In this scenario, there's 2 things that have happened. One is that when you look at the invoice lines, all of them except for the last one are going to be linked to purchase order lines, and they're going to have a little link sign next to them. And that's where they have gotten their fund information from. So for the first 6 titles, the invoice knows how to pay for those things. For the last one, it doesn't know how to pay for it because we didn't map a fund from the incoming invoice, and it didn't find a purchase order line that had a fund in it. And so in the invoice screen, the invoices are loaded as open, which basically means pending in invoice land as opposed to already ordered in order land. Because they're pending, you can edit the individual invoice lines. And if you have an invoice line that didn't link up to a purchase order line, but you know that it should have, then you can edit that invoice line and manually look up the purchase order by title, in this case, see in color, and link it up manually. And then that will bring in the fund, and it will save whatever the price is that came from the invoice line, because at the point of invoicing, the invoice line price is going to be more trustworthy than the order line price. So before I could finalize this invoice and approve it, I would need to make sure that this line was, it doesn't have to be linked to a purchase order line, but it has to have a fund and a quantity and a price. And right now it doesn't have a fund. So until I put that fund in or I link it to a purchase order line, I wouldn't be able to approve this invoice. Scott.
Edit the other one.
Mhm.
With that was.
Yes, so if it pulled in current books from the fund in the purchase order line, and you wanted to change it to next year's books or some funky endowment that you had a little bit of money left, you can edit the fund really easily. All right. So I think we're back to the PowerPoint, and it's this, everybody is used to their own machines. So, okay, that's you.
Oh, right. So now we get into exporting invoice data. And there ultimately, at the moment, there are two ways to export invoice data. And we say sort of, okay, invoice and voucher data. Just hearing a sound out of here, which is freaking me out. Okay. So when an invoice is approved, it generates what we call a voucher, which is basically a summary of the invoice activity, financial activity of that invoice based on external account numbers. So rather than by fund code, which is what the distributions on the invoice look like, we take all the external account numbers of those funds, and they could all be one external account number, and we summarize what payments are being made based on those external account numbers. So that's what the voucher does. The voucher export does include some data from the invoice, exchange rate, some other things. But all of this information can be exported via XML or JSON to an FTP location. And this export is done from the invoice application now under what you just saw there under voucher export. So there's a full screen view here now. And that was done to separate this activity from the settings area, basically so you have more control over what users are able to set up the export and what other users maybe are able to do in terms of actually, managing the export, running the export, downloading the associated files, and so on. So that's one method of getting invoice and voucher data out of Folio. The other way to do this is to export data to CSV. And there should be a little screen here, but that's okay. So the way that this is done, essentially in the invoice application, you can execute a search and run some filters, and you can take that results page, all of the invoices that are returned in that results area, and export them to a CSV file. And that is done essentially in the CSV. You will get a row for every invoice line. So you get invoice data and invoice line data, but you get rows in that CSV file based on invoice lines. So you can pull, all of your invoice data out to a CSV file if you want, or just a subset of your invoice data into a CSV file. And you can choose what data points from the invoice and invoice lines are actually exported. Not a very helpful slide. Sorry about that. Oh, there was a duplicate of the slide. Thank you. So this is just an example of that happening. That should have been shown earlier. So yeah, you run a search and then export to CSV, and then you can choose what data points. And this pattern exists in the orders application. It exists in the receiving application. So we've basically reused that pattern here. So this brings us to what is on the map at the moment for coming enhancements. And I'll just mention for orders, a few of the specific things are, and I think this was mentioned in the chat, or was a question in the chat, is to support order cancellation via EDIFACT. So when you cancel an order, as you may have inferred, there's no re-export of the order at the moment. That's a feature on our roadmap. And the other is to support claiming via EDIFACT export as well. So this would involve actually capturing some response information probably as well. That's something that we really do want to do, and it's on the roadmap as well for the order export.
And I just imported the invoice again and I updated the link in the PowerPoint. We'll upload the PowerPoint after the session, so it'll be hooked up to the to SCED. So for data import, National Library of Australia presented us with quite a little thing we have not run into before. They have something like 83,000 organizations, and the most we had seen before was maybe 15 or 20. Library of Congress only has 50-ish. And so 80,000 plus broke all kinds of things. We have fixed it now. We actually have 81,000 in Orchid Bug Fest. One of the other things that was breaking is when data import needed to do a lookup in organizations to assign the vendor to a new order, it wasn't able to handle that many lookups. And so all of those have been fixed in an Orchid service patch since NLA is live on Orchid and will be available in Poppy in case any of you have 20,000 plus vendors. We are also releasing as of Poppy a way to create or update multiple holdings and items for one purchase order line or one MARC Bibliographic record. So if you order 6 copies, 2 for main, 4 for remote storage, you'll be able to create 2 holdings and 6 items. And something that has come up several times when it comes to updating inventory records is wanting to be able to match on closed purchase order line numbers. Right now, you can only match on open purchase order line numbers or partially received, partially paid. And we deliberately decided not to match on closed in case libraries had closed purchase order lines or closed purchase order lines that had vendor reference numbers that were duplicated in the next purchase order line. So that's something we need to take a look at and expand the matching for. So those are all coming.
I think with that, we're essentially
Got there.
at time. So we're hoping to have some discussion here. Maybe if there are questions, you could always post them in the WOLFcon 23.
Yep.
And we'll keep an eye on that. Or just come ask your questions directly and we'll try to post a summary of some of that discussion. So
Always fun to be
thank you very much. Yeah.
first Zoom people.
An hour goes by a lot faster than you think.